Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth Strata Masterclass. My name is Narendran. I am a Senior Strategy Manager at Strata, and today we will be discussing the importance of legal due diligence and how we do that at Strata. To do so, I have with me Sonali Sylvia, Legal Associate at Strata. Sonali, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Now, just the first question, Sonali, why is legal due diligence important?
It's an extremely key and crucial aspect when you decide to purchase property, right? It's not just a matter of looking at a building or a unit and saying, hey, that's a fantastic property, I'd like to purchase it.
Yeah.
You really have to understand the nuances and all of the steps that went into actually purchasing and making that property.
Right.
So unless you look into the fundamentals of how that property came to be and the ownership it had before it, it does not make sense to just purchase something at face value.
So what you're telling me is that if a building, even if it is fantastic, right, it has an amazing tenant, it has a great yield, there's just no point buying it if something is wrong with it legally.
Absolutely. It's a make or break situation. Unless you find that ownership has transferred properly, if your approvals are in place, it would make sense to just buy 4 walls and a roof. So you will absolutely have to look into how that purchase actually happened and what really goes into making it a stellar building or a unit or an asset.
Got it. You know, I completely agree with you. And in fact, that is why I think we put so much emphasis into legal due diligence here at Strata.
Absolutely.
Now, as investors, everyone out there probably sees the end result of what your team does, which is the asset being listed on our platform, it being funded, and eventually the investors becoming shareholders of the SPV, right? But I'm sure there's a lot that goes before that. Could you maybe walk us through what we do with the legal due diligence at Strata before we acquire an asset?
Absolutely. So what investors would typically see is a final title due diligence report that is available on the investor dashboard, or whether your investment manager would share it with you. But prior to getting that full and final report, there is a lot of work that goes into it. Well, one, when we acquire a property and once we ascertain that this is a viable property for purchase, we'll have to start looking into all of the papers. So when I say papers, I mean papers pertaining to title, papers pertaining to revenue records, papers pertaining to compliances and approvals. So you preliminarily assess what exactly title is and how ownership has flown.
Right.
We look into ownership maybe spanning back up to 30 years.
30 years.
Yes.
Right.
So it's a comprehensive exercise that we do, at least preliminarily, before it goes into, say, transferring all of these documents to our external counsels. So internally, what we would do is we will assess all of the documents that the sellers provide. And what the sellers would typically provide is a bare bones collection of what documents they perceive to be title records. So you'd see your conveyance record, you'd see perhaps gift deeds and a few preliminary approvals of the building. So we will assess this at an early stage, at the nascent stage of deciding whether this property is viable. And then once we decide that, okay, this is good to go, we would give this to our external counsels, who would then take an in-depth analysis of title. So then again, the process of negotiating with the sellers and then a whole licensing process would ensue. What we would do is we would call for requisition of documents, several documents that we would require to fill in the gaps in title.
Understood.
So if we find that perhaps we're unable to ascertain how owner A got it from, say, owner Z previously, we would then ask for documents to further secure that title and to close and bridge that gap.
Interesting. So effectively at Strata, we go through a 2-step process. We do an initial due diligence internally to figure out if the asset is legally worthwhile. But we still do a second, more thorough legal due diligence, which is done with an external party.
Correct.
And it's only after this that we actually list the property on our platform.
Correct.
Makes sense.
So what all of this work would crystallize into is your final title due diligence report.
Which is what we share to our investors.
Correct. So therein you will find the conclusion that the property is actually valid and the title is marketable. It's only after we get this approval from our external counsels do we even think about listing this, the property on the platform.
Right.
So we ensure that every single step is covered and every single gap is accounted for before we put it up on the platform.
So I think you've given us a pretty good understanding of what we do before the asset is launched. What happens during the time of launch, while it is on the platform?
So while it's on the platform, typically now, since the asset is ready for all intents and purposes, it would be listed on the platform. Typically during this time, we will have a lot of queries from our investors, wherein of course they would have questions about how the asset was acquired, whether there are any red flags that we neglected to address, or if we have addressed, how have we addressed it. So questions pertaining to that would typically crop up during this time. Our department would usually tend to these queries. We get on calls with them, we give them documents that they would require, try to give them the comfort that they need to ensure that their investment is actually going into the right hands and it's for a viable asset.
Perfect.
So typically during launch time, this is what would be the bulk of our work.
Understood. And what happens after we fully fund the asset?
So after we fully fund the asset, it would move into registration of the asset. So when I say registration of the asset, it's now prior to registration, we will ensure that all of the transaction documents are ready. So your agreements for sale, your sale deeds, whatever conveyance instrument typically is drafted, and we ensure that we build enough security for our investors within it, because they will be the ultimate shareholders,
right,
and the benefactors of the property. So what we would do is we will draft all of the transaction documents, we will execute these transaction documents, and then the asset will be registered. So that typically is what happens in the post-funding stage. And parallelly, what we would do is we would typically execute a security subscription agreement, wherein all of the investors would be inducted as the shareholders of the SPV. From then on, whatever rental dispersal that we would get from the tenants or the licensees of the properties would flow into the SPV.
Right.
So that is typically the processes that we would undertake post-funding.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Now, I just wanted to cover, like, I'm not sure if investors know this, but I believe around 1% of all assets that we evaluate finally end up on the platform, right? And what are some of the red flags that cause the other 99% not to end up on the platform?
That is a fairly accurate assessment. We are extremely thorough with the sort of properties that we do end up listing. So typically what we do look into is, I'd say broad strokes, one, we would obviously look into if there are any gaps in title that we're unable to cover or reconcile.
Right.
So if there are documents missing straight up, or if we're unable to see how person A got title from person B, and there's absolutely no records to record that, then obviously that's a major red flag. We wouldn't typically proceed with properties of that nature. Two, if there are major deviations in the asset itself, for instance, you have violated height norms, or you don't have the necessary approvals or the NOCs, or within those approvals, if you had conditions which you have not complied with, or if there are area measurement discrepancies where the seller represents that it's actually 1,000 square feet and then you find it's actually lesser. So obviously that is a large red flag. Usually in order to curb that, we would also have a technical due diligence.
Right.
But again, that's part of the larger process, which I probably won't go into detail at the moment. So that's obviously another red flag. The third red flag that I would probably say is looking at the number of litigation on the property. So typically it's hard to find property in metropolitan cities without litigation.
Bit unfortunate.
It's a bit unfortunate, but again, the lower number of cases on a property, the better it is for you.
Right.
So we also do a thorough litigation search to see how many cases that might be put on a property pertaining to title or any certain disputes that might be. That's one other red flag to look out for. Also, for maybe a lesser known, maybe a future facing red flag would be if your correspondence with your seller or in the negotiation process, if your seller is unwilling to put in necessary security for you, assuming you were to face a dispute in the future, that is also something that you should be mindful of.
Very interesting. Effectively, if the seller says, if I understand this correctly, if the seller says, I'm not responsible for anything you find in the future, is that correct?
Not as black and white as that, but again, you never know what you might find in the future, right? And if your seller is reasonably certain that title has flown the right way, he should not typically be afraid to put in necessary safeguards. And typically it is a win-win situation. If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear.
Right. Makes perfect sense. I do have one last question for you. We've covered what we do before we acquire an asset. We've covered the process after, and we've also covered what happens, once the asset is in the hands of the investors. But this is something that a lot of investors do have questions on: is how liquidation is handled. And I mean liquidation, I mean the liquidation of the entire asset. Right? What goes behind, legally speaking, when Strata is enabling the liquidation of an asset?
Okay, so I'll quickly walk you through the liquidation process. So typically before deciding to liquidate, there is a whole other process where we ascertain whether it's the right time to exit and whether we'd be able to find the right person to sell the asset to. So once we've ascertained a purchaser, that's when the cogs start to move. So we typically enter into some sort of a binding agreement with the purchaser. We put in a letter of intent or a memorandum of understanding. Maybe a small token is paid to secure that transaction. And what the next process would be is then we will call for an EGM, an extraordinary general meeting. Yeah. So this EGM is typically called in order to pass a resolution wherein the consent of the current shareholders are taken to sell this property. So as shareholders of the property, they will have to give, as shareholders of the property, 75% of them will have to give their assent to the sale of this property.
75% of the attendees of the EG.
Correct, that's right. It's 75% present and voting.
Yes.
So once they give the assent to sell the property, typically that means that consent has been received. That's when we will start this process of due diligence with the buyer now.
Right.
So whatever documents that the purchaser would require, something we will provide, any doubts that he might have, we will clear that. Once he is certain, that's when the sale consideration would be transferred.
Makes sense.
So in tandem, what would happen is once the sale consideration is transferred, we will have the share transfer process. So the current shareholders will have to execute share transfer forms. So once share transfer forms are executed, typically the share transfers would be transferred to the current purchaser, who would now be the new owner.
Right.
So the monies would then be transferred, and according to the quantum of the investment made by the investors, the funds will be dispersed.
Thank you. I believe one of the things that you pointed out is really why legal due diligence is so important for Strata, is because not only are we acquiring an asset, effectively it is an investment, right? One day we are going to sell it. And if we didn't do our due diligence properly, tomorrow we may not be able to sell it.
Correct.
Because the buyer is going to be doing their due diligence. What we did when we acquired it, someone else is going to be doing the exact same.
Correct. So it's like a domino process, right? Unless your start and your foundation is perfect, you won't be able to get to the end. So it's just a matter of setting it up, keeping in mind that the beginning really also informs the end. So we look at diligence as a process from that entire bird's eye holistic perspective, right from how we acquire to how we will exit. So keeping that in mind, we ensure that all of the steps that we do are towards that goal.
Makes sense. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Sonali.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a super interesting conversation. And
Likewise.
I'm glad that I got the opportunity to do this.
Well, thank you so much. And if you would like to know more about investing with Strata, please visit our website, strataprop.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and most other social accounts. Thank you.
Thank you.